Hello. Today General Hospital will reveal the docks at Port Charles had always carried an air of melancholy, a mixture of salt, rust, and secrets, but on that fateful evening, the stillness itself seemed to bear witness to something extraordinary. The waves whispered against the wood in a rhythm that usually went unnoticed. Yet for Danny and Rocco, every sound, every flicker of water under the pale light, carried a weight far heavier than the night could contain. What began as nothing more than a curious pause at the edge of the pier shifted into a moment neither of them would ever escape. The outline of a body drifting near the surface of the water was undeniable, and with it came the sensation of dread crawling up their spines. They were frozen, not just in fear but in disbelief, because bodies on the water belonged to ghost stories and television, not to two boys who had never expected to see death staring back at them. Yet there it was, undeniable, chilling, and waiting for discovery. As the tide rolled the figure closer, the grim scene sharpened into focus. Limbs slack, hair plastered against pale skin, the man appeared to be just another casualty of the harbor, another lost soul consumed by Port Charles' underbelly. But when the moonlight caught his face, Danny's breath caught in his throat, and Rocco's mind reeled in confusion. The man was not a stranger. He was someone whose name had once echoed through their homes, someone mourned and spoken of in fragments of memory. Nathan. The name itself carried weight, not only for those who once loved him, but for the legacy of his absence. He had been gone, declared dead, a chapter closed too soon. Yet now, impossibly, his body floated between life and death, demanding recognition, daring them to believe what could not be true. Every instinct screamed at them to run, to flee from the horror before them. But something stronger, perhaps bravery, perhaps fate, held them there. Their hearts pounded, breaths uneven, yet their hands reached for the ropes, the edges of the dock, anything that could give them leverage. Together, they pulled against the heaviness of the water, their young arms straining against the weight of a man twice their size. Each tug brought Nathan closer to the surface, closer to the chance of survival, though neither boy truly knew if survival was even possible. When at last they dragged him onto the splintered wood of the pier, his body fell with a thud, lifeless in appearance, heavy as stone. For a heartbeat, it seemed their efforts had been for nothing, that all they had accomplished was retrieving a corpse. But then came a shudder, the faintest tremor in his hand, a weak flutter of breath from his lips. Nathan was alive, barely, but undeniably alive. That moment of realization should have brought relief, but instead it ignited a deeper terror, because if Nathan was alive, then everything they had been told about his death had been a lie. His survival was not just miraculous, it was damning evidence of secrets buried too deep, of a conspiracy that now reached its trembling fingers toward two boys who had seen too much. In saving him, Danny and Rocco had unknowingly stepped into a narrative that was never meant to involve them. They had disrupted a design carefully constructed, one that depended on Nathan staying gone, whether in life or in death. Now, their names and faces were etched into a story that powerful forces would fight to keep hidden. News of Nathan's survival would ripple through Port Charles like a stone cast into a pond. For his family and those who once grieved him, the revelation would be both a miracle and a nightmare. The grief they had lived with would be replaced by confusion, by the gnawing need for answers. How had he been written off as dead when his heart still beat? Who orchestrated the lie, and for what purpose? Nathan's presence on the pier was not random. It was the culmination of choices made by hands unseen, of intentions cloaked in shadow. His condition told its own story, a man battered, abandoned, left adrift in a place meant to consume him quietly. It was too precise to be accidental. This was not the chaos of chance but the precision of design. Speculation would begin to spiral, whispers forming in every corner of the community. Some would say Nathan had been the target of an assassination that had failed. Others would believe he had been a prisoner, finally breaking free only to collapse in exhaustion. Still others would fear that his return was no accident at all, but rather a calculated move, bait in a trap designed to ensnare those who still cared enough to protect him. Each theory carried weight, yet none offered comfort. The truth remained elusive, locked within Nathan himself, his memories fractured by whatever hell he had endured. But the danger was not confined to Nathan alone. Danny and Rocco, in their innocent act of courage, had placed themselves squarely in the crosshairs of forces far greater than they understood. They were no longer bystanders but participants, their discovery linking them to a truth that someone had fought desperately to erase. The shadows that had followed Nathan would now turn their gaze toward the boys, marking them as liabilities, witnesses, threats. What began as bravery could so easily become tragedy if those responsible for Nathan's disappearance chose to silence them. It was in this fragile space that Dante and Jason would find themselves drawn into the storm. Fathers first and protectors always. They would see in their son's fear the undeniable truth. Danger was no longer a distant possibility, but an immediate reality. Protecting Danny and Rocco would mean more than standing guard. It would mean unraveling the very plot that had tried to claim Nathan's life. The boy's safety depended on exposing the darkness that lurked beneath Port Charles, a darkness that had already shown it would stop at nothing. Dante and Jason would be forced to walk the thin line between justice and vengeance, each step bringing them closer to the truths hidden in the water that night. For Nathan, survival was not freedom but burden. His return carried with it the weight of everything he knew, everything he had endured, and everything he represented. His life was now a thread connecting past betrayals to present dangers, his very existence threatening to unravel carefully guarded secrets. The mystery of his death was no longer about loss, it was about deception, power, and the lengths to which someone had gone to maintain control. As he lay recovering, each shallow breath a testament to the boy's courage, the question of who had orchestrated his disappearance hung over the city, like a storm cloud ready to break. The night at the pier was more than just a rescue. It was the opening act of a new chapter in Port Charles, one where innocence collided with corruption, where the bravery of two boys disrupted the designs of the powerful. Nathan's survival promised answers, but it also promised danger, and for Danny and Rocco, the memory of that body in the water would never fade, because it was not only the night they saved a man, it was the night they changed the course of their own lives forever. Danny and Rocco's discovery of Nathan did not end the night they dragged him onto the dock. In truth, it was only the beginning. By becoming the only ones to witness the impossible return of a man long thought dead, they unknowingly stepped into a role that made them both invaluable and expendable. The knowledge they now carried was more dangerous than any weapon. In the wrong hands, it could unravel carefully constructed lies, expose those who thrived in secrecy, and topple the schemes of men and women who operated in the darkest corners of Port Charles. For those who had invested time and power into erasing Nathan from existence, the fact that two children had pulled him back into the world of the living was nothing short of a catastrophe. And like any catastrophe, it demanded containment. The boys would now be seen as liabilities, fragile links that had to be silenced before the truth spread any further. As whispers of Nathan's survival began to ripple through the community, Dante and Jason understood the peril before anyone else. Both men had lived long enough in Port Charles to recognize the signs of a storm gathering on the horizon. Their sons were no longer just innocent bystanders, they had become targets. And in Port Charles, targets had a way of disappearing. For Dante, the thought of his son being marked by faceless enemies awakened every instinct as a father and as a detective. For Jason, the idea that Danny had stumbled into the center of a conspiracy triggered the unyielding determination of a protector who had faced countless enemies before. Together, these men realized that their lives were no longer their own. Every move from this point on would be dictated by the need to shield their children and unravel the mystery that had placed them in danger. But the mission was larger than just protection. Nathan himself was the key, and as long as he breathed, he carried answers that could explain everything. Why he had been erased, who had orchestrated his supposed death, and what secrets he carried that made him such a threat to powerful forces. His memories, even fragmented, could illuminate truths that others had fought desperately to conceal. Yet those memories also made him a beacon for danger. If Nathan were allowed to speak, entire structures built on lies could collapse. If he remained silent, either through force or shadow network that had manipulated his fate would continue unchallenged. This reality placed not only Nathan's life in jeopardy, but also the lives of those closest to him, including the two boys whose courage had pulled him from the edge. The questions raised by Nathan's survival were both haunting and relentless. Who had wanted him gone? What purpose did his disappearance serve? If his death had been staged, then it was part of something far more elaborate than a simple act of violence. Someone had invested resources, time, and precision to remove him from the world. And the reasoning behind such a move could not be small. It was not grief that consumed the city now, but suspicion. Every glance carried doubt. Every silence carried the weight of a potential lie. The answers Nathan held threatened not just one person, but a whole chain of power that thrived in the dark. His return was the spark, and sparks, no matter how small, had the potential to ignite wildfires. Danny and Rocco's act of saving him was the kind of miracle that children believed themselves capable of, a gesture of instinctive bravery born from compassion. But to the forces hidden in the shadows, it was an unforgivable disruption. They had stolen from fate the very thing others had worked so hard to extinguish. The boy's presence that night was not just chance, it was defiance. And now that defiance had to be punished. In the eyes of the powerful, children were not off limits when secrets of this magnitude were at stake. The same enemies who had left Nathan to drown would not hesitate to chase down two boys who had become custodians of the truth. For Dante and Jason, this meant that hesitation was no longer an option. Their sons' lives hung in the balance, and the only way to protect them was to confront the threat head-on. Protecting Danny and Rocco meant unraveling every thread that tied Nathan's disappearance to the present. It meant identifying the architects of the plan, exposing their motives, and ensuring that Nathan lived long enough to reveal what he knew. It was not enough to hide the boys away or build walls around them. The darkness that had returned with Nathan's body would seep through every crack, until it was confronted and destroyed. Nathan's survival was more than just the return of a man presumed dead. It was the return of every unanswered question, every shadowy deal, every betrayal that had been buried under the guise of his death. His existence was proof that lies had been told, and that proof threatened to destabilize those who had built their lives on deceit. He was a living secret, and secrets, once exposed, had the power to set the world ablaze. Danny and Rocco had unknowingly lit that fire, and Dante and Jason now stood as the only barrier between their sons and the inferno that threatened to consume them all. The deeper Dante and Jason ventured into the tangled web of clues, the clearer it became that Nathan's return was not an isolated event. It was the unraveling of a larger plot that had been carefully stitched together, a plan so meticulous that even the smallest details had been accounted for except for one. No one had anticipated Danny and Rocco, two boys on the cusp of adolescence, stumbling into the truth and defying the shadows that had worked so hard to bury it. Their innocence had collided head-on with a conspiracy that thrived on silence, and now the conspiracy was trembling. From the very beginning, Dante recognized the significance of the security cameras. He pored over hours of footage, tracing timestamps and examining logs, only to discover that the recordings had gone black at the precise moment Nathan's body surfaced. The cut was surgical, not accidental, suggesting the work of someone with both access and technical expertise. Jason's mind, sharper than most when it came to patterns of sabotage, knew what this meant. There was someone inside the system, someone who had the authority or the leverage to manipulate evidence at will. The docks, often dismissed as just another forgotten corner of Port Charles, were now revealed to be a stage carefully prepared for Nathan's reappearance. It was a haunting realization what Danny and Rocco had seen was not just the resurfacing of a man thought dead, but the collapse of an operation designed to keep him erased. Then came the phone calls. The first arrived as a whisper in the dead of night, distorted and menacing, warning Dante to keep his son silent. The second was directed at Jason, delivered in the form of a voicemail that ended with the chilling sound of children's laughter, followed by static. Every word carried implication, every silence carried threat. These calls confirmed what they already feared. Danny and Rocco were being watched. The boys' every step was tracked, their every move anticipated. Their innocence turned into a liability. What had once been a nightmarish memory was now a living danger. As they traced leads across the city, Dante and Jason uncovered threads that tied Nathan to more figures in Port Charles than they could have imagined. Old grudges resurfaced, names long forgotten whispered back into relevance. Former allies who had once fought by Nathan's side now stood in shadowy corners, their loyalty in question. Rivals who had benefited from his absence now had reason to fear his return. And in the quiet moments of interrogation, both Dante and Jason began to suspect that this was not merely about Nathan as a man, but about what he knew. Nathan, even half-conscious and struggling for strength, carried fragments of memory like broken shards of glass. He remembered faces without names, whispers of deals made in backrooms, the metallic smell of blood and salt water, the impression of chains and confinement. He could not string these pieces together into clarity, but what he held in his mind was enough to unsettle the powerful. If those memories surfaced, if they were shared, they could dismantle alliances, expose betrayals, and bring to light crimes that had been carefully concealed. To some, Nathan alive was a miracle. To others, he was a threat more dangerous than death itself. All the while, Danny and Rocco bore the weight of their new reality. Though they were only boys, their world had shifted into something darker and heavier than childhood should ever allow. They carried not only the horror of seeing what they believed was a corpse, but the knowledge that they had pulled that corpse into life. At school, whispers followed them, though no one knew the truth. At home, their parents' eyes lingered too long, full of fear disguised as comfort. At night, they woke from dreams of dark water and lifeless faces, their young hearts unable to shake the feeling that someone was always watching from the shadows. Every shadow on the street seemed sinister, every stranger's glance a threat. Dante and Jason saw this fear, and it hardened into their resolve. For Dante, the protective instinct of a father fused with the relentless pursuit of justice that defined his career. He combed through files, revisited old cases, connected threads that others dismissed. For Jason, the fight was more personal, a battle against the kind of darkness he had known all his life. He reached out to contacts buried in the underworld, drew upon networks of loyalty forged in blood and trust, seeking whispers of who might have orchestrated Nathan's disappearance. Both men, different in method but united in purpose, knew that the only way to protect their sons was to strike at the heart of the conspiracy before it struck them. But the conspiracy was larger than either had expected. It reached into boardrooms and back alleys, touching both the polished hands of the elite and the dirty fists of criminals. Every step forward revealed another layer, another player in the game. Some sought power, others sought revenge, and still others sought simply to ensure that the truth remained buried forever. Yet through it all, one fact became undeniable. Nathan was the key. His survival was not the end of a story, but the beginning of one. A story that threatened to burn Port Charles from its foundations. For Danny and Rocco, their fear became the symbol of everything at stake. Their wide-eyed terror each time the phone rang, the way they clung to their father's presence, reminded Dante and Jason that this was more than a mission. It was survival. It was the fight for their children's futures. The image of those boys, fragile yet brave, fueled their determination to dismantle the web of lies thread by thread, no matter the cost. And so, what began as a discovery at the docks became a war fought in silence and shadows. It was no longer about Nathan alone, but about the network of power that had thrived on his absence. It was about two fathers unwilling to surrender their sons to fear. It was about two boys who had pulled a man from the water and, in doing so, lit a fire that could not be contained. Nathan's return was the spark, but the fire was spreading, and Port Charles would never be the same again. In the shadowed streets of Port Charles, where whispers often carry more weight than truths and shadows hide more than they reveal, Nathan's return was not just a resurrection, it was a grim reminder that in this city, nothing ever truly ends. Death itself is never a conclusion, only another mask for secrets waiting to claw their way into the light. His reappearance was less of a miracle and more of a harbinger, proof that the past never stayed buried and that the forces who had orchestrated his disappearance were still out there, still moving their pieces across the board. For the powerful and the corrupt, Nathan alive was a danger, a loose thread dangling from a carefully woven tapestry, and loose threads, if pulled long enough, could unravel the entire design. This realization cast a long shadow not only over Nathan's fragile existence, but over those who had drawn too close to the truth. Danny and Rocco, though only boys, had touched the secret with their own hands. They had pulled Nathan from the cold grip of the harbor, and in doing so had become more than just children. They were witnesses, liabilities, and potential martyrs to a cause they never chose to enter. Their lives, once defined by schoolwork, friendships, and the innocent trials of youth, were now tethered to something far more perilous. The conspirators, who had engineered Nathan's false death, would not sit idly by, while two young boys carried knowledge that could expose them. Innocence in Port Charles has always been fragile, and now it teetered on the edge of a blade. Dante and Jason understood this more than anyone. They had walked these streets long enough to know how the game was played, and how merciless the opponents could be. To them, this was no longer just a mission to protect their children. It was a war that would demand every ounce of strength, cunning, and sacrifice they had left. They knew the conspiracy would not hesitate. Each step closer to the truth meant more danger, and every hour Nathan remained alive meant that those in the shadows grew more desperate to erase him and everyone tied to him. Protecting their sons was not just a matter of building walls of safety. It was a matter of striking first, of rooting out the enemy before the enemy could strike. The return of Nathan became the ignition for something larger, a conflict that stretched far beyond one man. His survival stood as living evidence of lies that had poisoned the veins of the city. His memories, fragmented though they were, carried within them answers, and those answers could burn empires to the ground, but the cost of uncovering them would be blood. Dante and Jason could already feel it in the way their days turned restless, and their nights were filled with dread. Each lead they followed, each piece of evidence they uncovered, each suspicious silence or glance at all pointed toward the same conclusion. This was not a fight they could walk away from without consequence. For Nathan, his second chance at life was not liberation but burden. He bore the knowledge that people had tried to end him, and he bore the truth that those same people would not stop until the job was finished. His very breath endangered not just himself, but also the children who had saved him, and the families now bound to him. The conspirators would not care about collateral damage to them. Nathan was a problem to be erased, and anyone who stood beside him would fall under the same sentence. The line between survival and annihilation had never been so thin, and every passing moment blurred it further. For Danny and Rocco, the weight of this reality was crushing. Their wide eyes, once bright with youthful mischief, now reflected the raw fear of children forced to grow up too fast. They had seen what should never be seen, touched what should never have been touched, and now they lived under the watchful gaze of enemies hidden in the dark. They were no longer safe, no longer ordinary. Their fathers could see it in the way they clung closer, the way their sleep broke into nightmares, the way every sound outside their windows made them tense. It was that fear etched into the faces of their children that Dante and Jason could never forgive, and never allow to continue. The coming battle was inevitable. Port Charles was no stranger to bloodshed, but this would be different. This was not about turf wars or rivalries. This was about exposing a rot so deeply embedded that it infected the foundations of everything the city believed in. To succeed meant tearing open wounds that had festered for years, wounds that powerful people had gone to great lengths to conceal. To fail meant not only the death of Nathan, but also the silencing of two boys, whose only crime had been to care enough to save a man's life. And so, Dante and Jason prepared themselves for a fight that would test everything they were. They would face betrayal from those they once trusted, danger from enemies too cruel to name, and the constant fear of losing their children to a world too brutal for them. Every step forward would be a gamble, every truth uncovered a risk, every breath taken under the threat of being the last. But there was no retreat, no surrender. In Port Charles, nothing ever ends. A death is only the start of another story, and Nathan's survival had begun a chapter written in fire, blood, and unrelenting determination.